"You're nothing without me," Ryan said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. And Charlotte lowered her eyes as if the words had finally broken her, her fingers tightening around the glass until it trembled, everyone watching, waiting for her to disappear, just like they said she did. But 2 years later the doors of the gala opened, and she walked in, calm, untouchable, no longer looking at him at all. And when the billionaire Alexander Kane stepped forward and took her hand, the room went silent as he said, "You're late, Charlotte. The board is waiting." And Ryan finally realized. He had no idea who she had become. "You're nothing without me," Ryan Whitmore said, his voice smooth, practiced, and just loud enough to carry across the marble floor. And for a moment, even the soft clink of crystal glasses seemed to pause as every head turned toward Charlotte Hayes, standing there in a simple black dress that suddenly felt too thin against the weight of their attention, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute, the cold glass pressing into her skin as if to remind her she was still here, still breathing, still standing, even as the room quietly decided she was not, because they all knew Ryan Whitmore, the rising name in investment circles, the man who filled headlines in boardrooms, and they all remembered Charlotte only as the woman who used to stand beside him, smiling just a little too softly, speaking just a little too rarely, the one who had somehow faded as he rose. And now here she was again, smaller, quieter, exactly as they expected, exactly as he had always described. Her, a woman who had nothing without him. And Charlotte lowered her eyes, not in surrender but in stillness, her lashes casting faint shadows against her cheeks as she let the silence stretch, let his words settle, let them believe they had landed exactly where he intended, because Ryan mistook quiet for weakness, always had, mistook restraint for absence, mistook her patience for emptiness, and around them the whispers began to curl, soft and polite, like smoke no one wanted to acknowledge. While Ryan gave a small, satisfied smile, the kind that came from years of being right, or at least being believed, and he leaned slightly closer, as if offering something generous, something kind. "You should have stayed where you belonged," he added under his breath, but not quiet enough to keep it private, never gentle, and Charlotte felt it then, not pain, not even anger, but a clarity so sharp it steadied her heartbeat, because she remembered every dinner where she had sat beside him while he spoke over her, every decision he made for both of them, every moment he had rewritten her into someone smaller, just to make himself feel larger, and she remembered the night she finally understood that. Losing him was not the end of her life, but the beginning of something he would never be able to see. And still she did not look up. Not yet, because this moment was not for him. It was for her, the final echo of a version of herself she was about to leave behind. And when she finally lifted her gaze, it wasn't to argue, it wasn't to defend, it was simply to meet his eyes with something he did not recognize, something calm, something finished, and for the first time there was no need to speak. Because the silence said everything he had never understood, and everything she no longer needed him to hear. The drive home that night was quiet, but not empty, the kind of silence that hummed with something unfinished, something shifting beneath the surface. And Charlotte kept her hands steady on the wheel as the city lights blurred past her window, each one reflecting faintly against the glass like fragments of a life she no longer belonged to, because everything about that world had once been built around Ryan, his schedule, his ambitions, his voice filling every room until there had been no space left for her own. And she remembered how easily she had adjusted, how naturally she had stepped back, convinced that love meant making room for someone else to shine, until one day she realized she had disappeared completely, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, piece by piece, decision by decision, until even she could not recognize the woman looking back at her in the mirror. And that was the moment everything began to change, though no one else noticed, not Ryan, not their friends, not the world that had already decided who she was. Because transformation rarely announces itself, it begins quietly, in small choices that no one applauds, in early mornings and long nights, in the decision to learn again, to try again, to rebuild something from nothing. And Charlotte started with what she still had, a degree she had never used, skills she had set aside, and a mind that had always been sharper than anyone gave her credit for. And she took a job that no one in her old circle would have respected, sitting behind a modest desk in a quiet office where no one knew her last name, where no one cared about who she used to be, only about what she could do. And at first it felt like falling, like starting over at the bottom of a world she once overlooked. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to feel like freedom, because for the first time her progress belonged only to her, not to a man standing beside her, not to a name attached to hers. And she worked, not for recognition, but for clarity, learning how decisions were made, how money moved, how power was built and protected. And there were nights when exhaustion pressed against her bones, when doubt whispered that Ryan had been right, that she had stepped too far outside the life she understood. But each time she kept going, not with loud determination, but with a quiet refusal to stop, and months turned into a year, and then another, and the woman who once stood in that marble room began to fade into memory, replaced by someone steadier, someone who did not need to be seen to know her own worth. And then one afternoon, in a conference room that smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paper, she noticed a man watching her from across the table, not with curiosity, not with dismissal, but with recognition, as if he saw something others had overlooked, something she had spent years uncovering. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, precise, and entirely certain, asking her a question no one had ever asked her before, not about Ryan, not about her past, but about her ideas. And for the first time in a very long time, Charlotte answered without hesitation, unaware that this moment, quiet and almost invisible to everyone else, was the beginning of everything changing in a way Ryan Whitmore would never see coming. The question lingered in the air long after Charlotte finished answering, not because it was complicated, but because it was clear, precise, and undeniably hers. And for a brief moment the room shifted in a way she could feel without anyone saying a word, as if something invisible had been acknowledged, something that could not be undone. And the man across the table, Alexander Kane, studied her with a quiet intensity that was not intimidating but exact, like someone measuring value instead of appearance. And he gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to signal that he had heard her, truly heard her. And that alone felt unfamiliar, because Charlotte had spent years speaking in rooms where her words were either softened, redirected, or quietly ignored. And now there was no interruption, no correction, only a stillness that carried weight. And as the meeting moved forward, she noticed the subtle changes, the way others began to look at her differently, the way her ideas were referenced, not dismissed. And it was not immediate transformation, not some dramatic shift, but a series of small recalibrations that began to build something undeniable. And over the following weeks Alexander's presence appeared more often, never announced, never explained, but always deliberate. And he asked questions no one else thought to ask, not just about numbers or projections, but about intention, about structure, about how she saw the long term when everyone else was focused on the immediate gain. And Charlotte found herself answering without hesitation, not because she had rehearsed, but because she had already done the work in silence long before anyone was watching. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her role expanded, not through titles or declarations, but through trust, through decisions that began to carry more weight than her position suggested. And one evening, as the city settled into that quiet glow between late hours and early morning, Alexander asked her to stay after a meeting, the room emptying until it was just the two of them and the low hum of the lights above. And he placed a file on the table, sliding it toward her with the same calm precision he applied to everything else. And when she opened it, she realized it was not a task, not an assignment, but an opportunity disguised as a question, one that would require her to step beyond everything she had been doing quietly and into something far more visible, something that would change not only her position, but her place in the world she had once been excluded from. And for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but because she understood exactly what accepting it would mean, that there would be no returning to invisibility, no shrinking back into the safety of being overlooked. And Alexander watched her with that same steady focus, not pushing, not persuading, simply waiting, as if he already knew the answer but respected the moment it took for her to claim it. And Charlotte closed the file slowly, lifting her gaze to meet his, the same way she had in that room weeks ago. Only this time there was no trace of the woman who had once lowered her eyes to survive. only someone who understood her own value without needing to prove it. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, certain, and entirely her own, setting in motion something that, miles away in a world of glass towers and familiar names, Ryan Whitmore would soon feel without understanding why. Not yet. Not until it was far too late to change anything at all. The shift did not announce itself with applause or headlines. It moved quietly through boardrooms and balance sheets, through signatures and decisions that carried more weight than most people in that world would ever realize, and Charlotte stepped into it without hesitation, not because she was fearless, but because she had already spent years learning how to stand in uncertainty without losing herself. And the project Alexander had placed in her hands began to unfold with a precision that surprised even those who had doubted her, because she did not chase attention. She built structure. She did not speak to impress. She spoke to align, and slowly the results began to surface, first in small reports, then in meetings where her name was mentioned with a tone that had shifted from curiosity to respect, and eventually in rooms where decisions were no longer made without her input. And still she remained composed, never reaching for recognition, never correcting the narrative, allowing the work to speak in a language that no one could dismiss. And across the city, in a tower of glass and steel where everything reflected success whether it was real or not, Ryan Whitmore began to notice something he could not quite define, a hesitation in conversations, a deal that did not close as expected, a competitor that seemed to anticipate his moves before he made them. And at first he dismissed it as coincidence, because men like Ryan did not believe in forces they could not see. But the pattern persisted, subtle yet undeniable, threading through his world in ways that felt almost deliberate. And one afternoon, as he sat in a meeting reviewing a proposal that had been placed in front of him with unusual urgency, his attention caught on a detail so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, a name attached to a decision that redirected an entire strategy, and he frowned slightly, not recognizing it, not understanding why it felt familiar. And as the discussion continued, that name surfaced again, not loudly, not as a headline, but as a constant, a presence woven into outcomes he could not control. And for the first time in a long while, Ryan felt something close to discomfort, not fear, but a quiet disruption to the certainty he had always relied on. While miles away, Charlotte stood in a different room, one filled with the same polished surfaces and controlled conversations, yet entirely different in the way it moved around her, because here she was not an accessory, not a shadow, but a force that shaped direction without needing to announce itself. And Alexander observed it all with that same steady attention, never interfering, never claiming credit, allowing her to occupy the space she had earned. And as the evening settled into a calm, deliberate rhythm, Charlotte found herself standing by a wide window overlooking the city, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance. And for a brief moment, she thought about the woman she used to be, the one who believed she needed someone else to define her place in this world. And the contrast was no longer painful. It was simply distant, like a memory that had lost its weight. And somewhere across that skyline, Ryan was beginning to sense that something had changed, something he could not yet see, something that had been set in motion long before he realized it existed. And Charlotte did not look back, because she did not need to. The distance between who she was and who she had become was already greater than anything he could ever cross. The invitation arrived without warning, a thick envelope placed neatly on Charlotte's desk among a stack of documents that carried far more immediate importance. Yet something about it demanded attention, not because of its design, though it was understated and expensive in a way that signaled intention rather than display, but because of the name embossed across the front, a name she had not seen in this context for years. And as her fingers brushed over the smooth surface, she already knew what it was before she opened it, already felt the quiet shift in the air around her, as if the past had finally decided to step forward and acknowledge the present. And when she unfolded the card inside, her eyes moved steadily across the lines, taking in every detail without a flicker of surprise. A charity gala, one of the largest of the season, attended by the same circle of investors, executives, and carefully curated reputations that had once defined her entire world. And at the center of it all, listed among the key hosts, was Ryan Whitmore, his name positioned exactly where she would have expected it, prominent, confident, unchanged, and for a brief moment the memory of that night in the marble room surfaced, not with pain, but with clarity, the exact tone of his voice, the weight of every word he had chosen so deliberately, and the way the room had accepted it without question, and Charlotte closed the invitation slowly, placing it back on the desk with the same precision she applied to everything else, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface as she considered not whether she would go, but why it mattered now, because this was no longer about proving anything, no longer about reclaiming a place she had lost. It was simply a convergence of two paths that had once been intertwined and were now entirely separate. And yet the timing was not accidental, not in a world where timing was rarely left to chance. And as she leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze steady, she understood that this moment had been approaching long before the invitation arrived, built through every decision, every quiet step forward, every choice to remain unseen until it mattered. And across the city, Ryan stood in a room filled with familiar voices and predictable conversations, discussing the same event with the same confidence he brought to everything, unaware that the carefully constructed narrative he relied on was about to encounter something it had never accounted for. And as Charlotte reached for her phone, her movements calm, deliberate, she sent a brief confirmation, a single response that required no elaboration, no explanation, just a presence acknowledged. And when she set the phone back down, there was no hesitation, no anticipation, only a quiet certainty that the next time they stood in the same room, nothing would need to be said for everything to be understood, because the woman who had once lowered her eyes to survive was not returning to that space as a memory. She was returning as something entirely different, something the world would recognize even if he did not, at least not at first. The days leading up to the gala moved with a quiet precision, each hour unfolding exactly as planned. Yet beneath the surface there was a shift that could not be measured in schedules or meetings, something steady and inevitable that Charlotte carried with her without needing to name it. And on the evening itself the city seemed to glow with a kind of restrained anticipation. The streets lined with black cars and soft lights reflecting off polished glass, as if the entire skyline understood the significance of what was about to unfold. And Charlotte stood in front of a mirror in a room that felt calm rather than grand, her reflection clear, composed, unchanged in ways that mattered, and entirely transformed in ways that did not need to be explained, her dress simple but deliberate, a deep shade that held the light without chasing it, her movements unhurried as she adjusted a single detail and then stepped back, not to evaluate, but to acknowledge, because this was not about appearance, not about proving anything to anyone who had already decided who she was. It was about presence, about stepping into a space she had once been diminished in and occupying it without permission. And when she finally left the room, the quiet followed her, not as an absence of sound, but as a kind of control, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And across the city the venue shimmered with its usual display of elegance, chandeliers casting warm light over a sea of carefully curated conversations, each one layered with intention, alliances forming and dissolving in the span of a handshake. And at the center of it all Ryan moved with practiced ease, his voice carrying just enough, his confidence intact, the same rhythm he had always relied on. And yet there was a subtle tension beneath it, something he could not quite place, as if the night held a variable he had not accounted for. And as guests continued to arrive, the energy in the room began to shift in ways that were almost imperceptible, a slight pause in conversation here, a glance toward the entrance there, the kind of ripple that spreads before anyone acknowledges its source. And then the doors opened, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with a quiet inevitability, and Charlotte stepped inside, her presence immediate without being forceful, her gaze steady as it moved across the room, not searching for anyone, not avoiding anything, simply observing. And for a moment the noise softened, not because it stopped, but because attention had shifted, and those who recognized her felt it first, the dissonance between who they remembered and who stood before them now, the absence of hesitation, the absence of need. And across the room Ryan turned, drawn not by her movement but by the change in the air, and when his eyes found her, there was a fraction of a second where recognition struggled to align with reality, because the woman he thought he understood no longer fit within the boundaries he had created for her. And Charlotte did not rush the moment, did not approach, did not react. She simply existed within the space as if she had always belonged there. And somewhere beyond the immediate circle of attention, Alexander stood, observing with that same quiet certainty, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because some things did not need to be orchestrated, they only needed to be revealed. And as the room slowly adjusted to her presence, Charlotte took a single step forward, not toward the past, but toward everything that had been set in motion long before this night began, and the distance between who she had been and who she was now became visible in a way no one could ignore, even if they did not yet understand it. Ryan did not move immediately, not because he did not want to, but because something in the moment held him in place, a subtle hesitation that had never belonged to him before. And as he watched Charlotte take another step into the room, he felt the unfamiliar weight of uncertainty settle just beneath his confidence, the kind that could not be dismissed with a smile or redirected with a clever remark. And around him conversations resumed in fragments, quieter now, more observant, as if the room itself had shifted its attention without asking permission. And the woman standing across from him no longer fit the narrative he had built so carefully over the years, because she was not avoiding him, not acknowledging him, not even reacting to his presence. She was simply existing beyond it, and that absence of response unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could, and he adjusted his posture slightly, the movement small but deliberate, as if reclaiming control over a space that suddenly felt less predictable. And when he finally began to move toward her, each step carried the same confidence he had always relied on. Yet beneath it, there was a quiet calculation, an attempt to understand what had changed and how to restore the balance he believed had always been his. And Charlotte noticed him approaching without turning, the awareness settling into her posture without tension, without urgency, because she had already lived through every version of this moment in her mind long before it arrived. And when she finally faced him, her expression was calm, not guarded, not distant, simply complete. And for a fraction of a second Ryan searched her face for something familiar, something he could recognize and therefore control, but there was nothing there that belonged to him anymore. And the realization did not strike all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a detail coming into focus too late to ignore, and he offered a smile, the same one that had carried him through countless negotiations and carefully managed encounters. "Charlotte," he said, her name resting in the air between them as if it still held the same meaning it once did. But she did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because there was no need to fill the silence. And when she did speak, her voice was steady, measured, and entirely unaffected. "Ryan," she replied, the simplicity of it stripping away any assumption of familiarity. And for the first time he felt the absence of something he had never questioned before, the absence of influence, of expectation, of the quiet power he once held over every interaction they shared. And the conversation that followed was brief, not because it lacked substance, but because it did not need to extend beyond what was already understood. His questions edged with curiosity he tried to disguise as casual interest, her answers precise, offering nothing more than what was necessary. And as the exchange ended, Charlotte did not linger, did not wait for acknowledgement or closure. She simply stepped away, her attention shifting to the room, to the people, to the conversations that now moved around her with a different kind of alignment. And Ryan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching as others began to approach her, not with the polite recognition reserved for someone from the past, but with a respect that suggested something far more current, far more relevant. And somewhere in the distance Alexander began to move, his presence cutting through the room with a quiet authority that did not need introduction. And Ryan followed the direction of that movement without fully understanding why, only sensing that whatever was about to happen next would not fit within any expectation he had prepared for. And for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer the one in control of the story unfolding around him.